June 15, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. The roar of Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines echoes over the newly captured airfield as engineers and ground crews work under the unrelenting island sun. Less than a week earlier, U.S. Marines had secured the island after one of the most intense campaigns of the Pacific War. Now, the Army Air Forces were racing to turn it into the launch pad for a new weapon, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Each B-29 represented the height of American air power, capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs at altitudes beyond most Japanese interceptors. Yet, as the first squadrons of the 73rd Bomb Wing arrived on Saipan, a grim realization settled over planners at XXI Bomber Command Headquarters. The massive bombers could reach Tokyo, but they could not return without peril. Fuel consumption across the 3,000-mile round trip was far beyond projections. General Curtis E. LeMay, commanding XXI Bomber Command, noted in operational reports that the loss rate due to fuel exhaustion is unacceptable. The missions were burning through aviation fuel at rates that strained the entire Pacific logistics system. Tankers were sunk en route. Airfields on Tinian and Guam lacked adequate storage. By October 1944, several B-29s returning from test runs had ditched at sea. Their tanks are wide-eyed in the war rooms of Tinian's North Field. American engineers and logistics officers faced an unprecedented challenge, sustaining long-range bombing over the Japanese homeland from tiny island bases thousands of miles from supply depots. Conventional refueling infrastructure was impossible. Tankers at sea could not reach the islands under threat of submarine attack. The only way to deliver the lifeblood of the Superfortress, 100-octane aviation gasoline, was through the air itself. It was a radical idea, born not from innovation but necessity. Colonel Clifford J. Heflin of the Air Transport Command ATC proposed converting surplus bombers and transports into airborne fuel carriers, flying gas stations that could deliver bulk aviation fuel directly to the forward bases. His team began modifying B-24 Liberators and C-109 cargo conversions at Hamilton Field, California. The C-109, a variant of the B-24, was stripped of its armament, reinforced internally, and equipped with sealed fuel tanks that could carry up to 2,900 gallons of gasoline per flight. Every gallon came at a cost. Each sortie from the U.S. mainland or from Kwajalein Atoll to Tinian covered over 3,000 miles of open Pacific, often through unpredictable tropical weather. Crews faced long, monotonous flights, and each takeoff was a gamble. The aircraft loaded to its maximum weight, the fumes of fuel filling the fuselage. Still, the operation was essential. Without fuel, the B-29 campaign, the very strategy designed to cripple Japan's war production, would collapse before it began. By late October 1944, the first C-109s began arriving at North Field. Their arrival marked the start of an unsung logistical operation that would quietly determine the success of the entire air war over Japan. For every superfortress that thundered toward Tokyo, there was a flying gas station that made its journey possible. In official records, it was simply called Operation Matterhorn Logistics Support, a network stretching from India and the Pacific Islands to the Marianas. But to the men on the ground, these fuel ferries became the unseen guardians of the sky, the difference between reaching home and being lost at sea. November 1944, North Field, Tinian. The dawn light catches on the silver wings of a C-109 as its four engines rumble to life. The smell of high-octane fuel hangs in the air, and the heat from the runway shimmers across rows of B-29s preparing for their first large-scale missions over Tokyo. Beneath the surface calm lies a logistical race few would ever see. One fought not with bombs, but with barrels. By now, the U.S. Army Air Forces had committed to an extraordinary effort, maintaining a constant aerial fuel bridge from bases as far away as Guam, Kwajalein, and the Caroline Islands to the Marianas. The C-109 flying gas stations, flown by crews of the Air Transport Command's Pacific Division, became the essential arteries feeding the B-29 war machine. Their task: deliver aviation gasoline, lubricants, and even auxiliary fuel tanks directly to forward depots. Each flight carried more than 10 tons of fuel, but at a terrible efficiency. Historical records from the 20th Air Force's logistics branch show that nearly 1/5 of the gasoline was consumed just to transport the rest. Still, it was a price that had to be paid. Without these flights, B-29s could not take off with full bomb loads. General Henry H. Hap Arnold, Chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces, acknowledged this in a November 1944 memo. Every gallon delivered to Tinian or Guam is worth its weight in bombs over Japan. The C-109s were not glamorous machines. Derived from battle-worn B-24s, they lacked armor and carried no defensive guns. Their fuselages were lined with sealed tanks and metal piping, leaving no room for anything else. Pilots described the flights as tense but monotonous. 8 to 10 hours over endless ocean, often in darkness, navigating by radio beacons or celestial fixes. Any engine trouble meant ditching into waters patrolled by Japanese submarines. On Tinian, the incoming tankers landed in a precise ballet of scheduling. As soon as each C-109 touched down, ground crews rolled in portable pumps to offload the precious cargo. The gasoline was filtered, tested for impurities, and shunted through makeshift pipelines or fuel trucks directly to B-29 dispersal points. Engineers constructed sprawling fuel farms using 55-gallon drums stacked in neat rows, each marked with octane ratings and distribution codes. Behind this effort stood the XXI Bomber Command Service Command, a logistical unit commanded by Brigadier General Glenn O. Barkis. Barkis and his staff transformed barren coral airstrips into one of the most sophisticated refueling hubs of the war. Army Corps of Engineers records show that by December 1944, Tinian's fuel storage capacity had expanded from 250,000 gallons to over 5 million gallons, nearly all of it ferried by air. Every operation had its costs. Engine failures, navigation errors, and the sheer fatigue of repetitive long-haul missions took their toll. On December 18, 1944, a C-109 bound for Guam vanished en route from Kwajalein. No trace of the aircraft or its crew was ever found, yet their absence barely slowed the relentless pace. The fuel line had to remain unbroken. As December closed, B-29s began their first full-scale bombing raids over Tokyo and Nagoya. Thousands of miles away, anonymous crews aboard the flying gas stations continued their runs through tropical storms and monsoon squalls, ensuring the bombers had the fuel to return. It was a silent partnership, the thunderous bombers that the world saw, and the fuel carriers that the world never knew existed. In war dispatches, their contribution was rarely mentioned. But within LeMay's command reports and Arnold's correspondence, the truth was clear. The success of the B-29 offensive depended entirely on these airborne lifelines. January 9, 1945, North Field, Tinian. In the humid Pacific dawn, ground crews guided B-29 Dauntless Dottie of the 497th Bomb Group onto the runway. It was commanded by Brigadier General Haywood S. Hansel, Jr., who had overseen the first major firebombing attempts over Japan. Yet behind every aircraft like Dauntless Dottie stood an invisible network of men and machines that made its 3,000-mile journey possible, the flying gas stations of the Air Transport Command. By early 1945, the logistical burden of the B-29 campaign had reached unprecedented scale. Operation Matterhorn, the earlier system of flying fuel from India to Chinese staging fields, had been phased out in favor of direct operations from the Marianas. Now, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian formed the backbone of the 20th Air Force. Their power came not from size or numbers, but from fuel millions of gallons arriving through the air each month. Records from the U.S. Army Air Forces Material Command show that between January and March 1945, over 40 million gallons of aviation fuel were airlifted to the Marianas, the majority aboard C-109 conversions. At the peak of operations, hundreds of these modified Liberators shuttled daily across the Central Pacific, flying in a vast, unseen convoy that stretched from Hawaii to Guam. The operation was perilous, though unheralded. Crews navigated through the volatile weather systems of the Western Pacific, where storms rose suddenly from the sea. There were no escort fighters, no rescue ships waiting along the route. A failed engine or a navigation error could end in silence over the water. One ATC pilot later wrote in his after-action report, "We never saw the enemy, but the ocean was enemy enough." Meanwhile, the fuel they carried transformed the campaign in the air. By February 1945, LeMay had replaced Hansel as commander of XXI Bomber Command and radically reorganized the bombing strategy. Instead of high-altitude daylight raids, LeMay ordered low-level night attacks using incendiaries. This shift, which culminated in the March 9th to 10th raid on Tokyo, was only possible because of the vast reserves of aviation fuel now stockpiled on Tinian and Guam. Reserves delivered almost entirely by AIR-TO support LeMay's intensified operations. The service command built pipeline networks connecting fuel depots to every runway. Tanker trucks ran around the clock, refueling dozens of B-29s in carefully timed intervals. At the same time, C-109 flights increased to sustain the escalating demand. On average, a single night of B-29 operations consumed more than 200,000 gallons of fuel. The flying tankers' crews worked in near anonymity. They flew without combat glory, decorations, or headlines. Yet their missions determined whether the bombers could launch the next day. When weather grounded tankers, raids were delayed. When fuel lines fell behind, LeMay's staff adjusted sortie schedules accordingly. Every mission over Japan was measured not just in bombs, but in barrels. In a March 1945 report to General Arnold, LeMay acknowledged the quiet foundation beneath his air war. "Our success from the Marianas depends on a continuous flow of fuel. The men of the Air Transport Command are fighting a different kind of war, one of endurance." The flying gas stations never appeared in combat footage, yet their steady rhythm of takeoff and landing became the heartbeat of the B-29 offensive. By spring 1945, that rhythm was carrying the war ever closer to Japan's doorstep. May 1945, North Field, Guam. The vast coral airstrip shimmered under the Pacific sun as B-29 bombers taxied into formation, their engines droning in synchronized precision. Across the field, a C-109 fuel transport lumbered down the parallel runway, bound once again for Tinian with another load of gasoline. Though the war's end now seemed near, the fuel line could not falter, not even for a data by mid-1945. The U.S. Army Air Force's logistical machine had evolved into one of the most efficient aerial supply networks in history. From Harmon Field on Guam to Isley Field on Saipan, aviation fuel storage tanks dotted the landscape like metal islands. Each of them, in effect, represented thousands of miles of flight time carried by the flying gas stations that sustained the war effort. According to the official 20th Air Force Statistical Summary for May 1945, more than 60 million gallons of aviation gasoline had been delivered by air to the Marianas since the start of operations, a logistical feat with no precedent. Engineers had calculated that for every gallon consumed by a B-29 on a mission, nearly 2 gallons had been spent to deliver it from the United States or Pacific supply points. Yet the strategy was working. The bombers now flew daily. The results were visible in the night skies over Japan. Between March and July 1945, relentless incendiary raids destroyed or damaged more than 60 Japanese cities, crippling industrial capacity and transport infrastructure. These operations, led by General Curtis LeMay, depended entirely on the constant resupply of fuel, lubricants, and munitions from the Pacific Island chain. While the B-29s burned through thousands of gallons per sortie, the C-109s labored endlessly to keep them flying. Flight logs from the Air Transport Command's Pacific Division detail thousands of tanker missions completed during this period. Pilots often flew without rest, landing on Tinian, unloading, and immediately turning back for another run to Guam or Kwajalein. Each flight was meticulously logged, and every gallon accounted for in the Service Command's daily reports. In May, a tropical cyclone near the Caroline Islands disrupted the supply chain. Several tankers were forced to turn back, and one C-109 went missing en route from Eniwetok to Tinian. The incident caused temporary fuel shortages that delayed planned B-29 missions against Kyushu. These disruptions underscored how fragile the entire operation remained. A single storm could ripple across the entire bombing campaign to counter this. The Army Air Forces introduced pipeline barges and expanded sea convoys once the Japanese submarine threat diminished. Yet even with improved sea routes, the flying tankers continued their crucial role. They could deliver supplies faster, directly, and in emergencies when ships were delayed. In several documented cases, C-109s delivered specialized aviation lubricants and experimental fuel mixtures needed for the B-29's R-3350 engines. Components that ships could not deliver quickly enough by summer 1945. As the Allies prepared for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, the logistical foundation built by the flying gas stations had reached full maturity. Fuel reserves on Tinian, Saipan, and Guam stood at their highest levels of the war. The Superfortress fleet could now launch around-the-clock operations without pause. In August, these same bases became the departure points for two of the most consequential missions in history: the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both the Enola Gay and Boxcar departed from airfields whose fuel stocks had been built, flight by flight, through the relentless efforts of the C-109 crews. Every drop that fueled those missions had been part of the same logistical chain that began a year earlier, when engineers first imagined airplanes carrying fuel instead of bombs. As the war neared its close, the flying gas stations continued their work, quietly, efficiently, and largely unnoticed, until Japan's surrender made their missions no longer necessary. August 15, 1945, Tinian Island, Marianas. At dawn, the tropical airfield lay unusually quiet. The engines that had thundered day and night were still. News of Japan's surrender had reached the Marianas hours earlier, and crews stood together on the runways where they had labored for nearly a year. Nearby, a row of C-109s rested under the morning sun, the flying gas stations whose unheralded missions had fueled victory itself. In the records of the 20th Air Force, the story of these aircraft appears in only a few lines. Tonnage delivered, flights completed, losses sustained. Yet behind those figures lay one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements of the Second World War. The C-109s, along with modified B-24 tankers and transport crews of the Air Transport Command's Pacific Division, had flown more than 30,000 missions by the war's end, carrying millions of gallons of fuel that made every B-29 sortie possible. Without them, the great strategic bombing campaign against Japan, the largest and longest sustained air offensive of the Pacific War, could not have been maintained. Each flight across the Pacific bridged the gap between the industrial power of the United States and the remote island runways from which the Superfortress launched. The flying gas stations formed a logistical bridge that no ship or pipeline could replace at the time. The men who flew these missions seldom saw combat. They rarely appeared in dispatches or received decorations. But their courage lay in persistence, in navigating thousands of miles over open ocean with volatile cargo, in landing heavy-laden aircraft on coral runways, and in enduring monotony and risk without recognition. One ATC pilot later summarized their role in a post-war interview preserved by the Air Force Historical Research Agency. "The bombers got the headlines. We just made sure they could get home." After the war, most of the C-109s were decommissioned or scrapped, their purpose having been fulfilled. Yet the lessons learned from their operations transformed the future of air logistics. The concept of aerial fuel transport, once improvised from necessity, evolved into formal aerial refueling systems that would define the jet age. Within a decade, the U.S. Air Force introduced the KC-97 and later the KC-135 Stratotanker, aircraft capable of refueling bombers and fighters in midair. These modern tankers traced their lineage directly to the wartime ingenuity of the Pacific flying gas stations. General Curtis LeMay, who would later become Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, often emphasized the importance of logistics over firepower. In his 1949 address to the Air War College, he stated, "No bomber ever took off without the unseen work of those who supplied its wings with fuel. The quiet efficiency of the supply chain was as decisive as any combat operation." Today, the legacy of the C-109 and its crews remains a testament to that truth. They represented a different kind of heroism, one measured not in victories or decorations, but in endurance and precision. Every drop of gasoline they delivered pushed the Pacific Air War forward, one flight at a time. Standing now on the old airfields of Tinian and Guam, the remnants of rusted fuel drums and cracked runways still whisper the story of that effort. A reminder that history's victories are built not only on courage in battle, but on the invisible labor that sustains it. The flying gas stations of World War II never fired a shot, yet they powered the missions that brought the war to its close. Their contribution remains one of the quiet triumphs of logistics, engineering, and human perseverance, the hidden power behind the superfortress that changed the course of the Pacific War.